Have you guys ever heard of road rage? Okay, who hasn't, right? Have any of you seen somebody in a fit of road rage? Have any of you ever been in a fit of road rage? Right? If it's not you, then it's somebody. You know that there's always somebody. You can count on somebody on the road that'll go 10 miles under the speed limit, and then somebody else who will have road rage. I'm usually the latter. And if I don't know if you're anything like me or not, like that's just my go-to is like to just, it's like something possesses me when I get behind a steering wheel. And it is like I'm just a different person. And I'm better at it now than I used to be. But now it's like when there's kids screaming in the car with me, it gets worse. It's like, get out of my way, I need to get where I'm going because my kids are driving me crazy, right? The reality is none of us really like or are comfortable with rage of any kind. But most of us, we experience it sometimes on the daily. We feel this whether it's something that we express outwardly or inwardly, you and I know what it's like to be just perpetually frustrated. Let's just say we like to use the word frustrated more than mad or angry, because nobody likes to be known as an angry person, but frustrated is more socially acceptable. What's the difference between the two? I don't know. You can debate it amongst yourselves later. I don't think there is much of a difference, other than frustrated sounds nicer. It's more socially acceptable to be frustrated than it is to be angry. You don't want to be known as the angry person, but when your parents ground you for something that you don't think is fair, it's pretty quick to get frustrated. You're frustrated at your parents, or you're frustrated at the sibling who borrowed some clothes from you and then lost it in the wash, or it shrunk because they weren't supposed to put it in the dryer and they did anyway. Or you're frustrated when you see one person act like a total jerk to everybody else, but then seems like they never get in trouble for it, and you just wish secretly that they would face plant right in front of the entire class. And that would be really nice, but you're not mad at them, you're just frustrated with them, right? Frustrated is more acceptable, but whether you want to call it rage or anger or frustration, we all know the feeling, we all know what it feels like to have that and for it to kind of overwhelm some of our thoughts. And the thing about anger is it doesn't always look the same. You guys know this because you're people and you've been around people, and you know that some people manifest their anger in screaming and shouting and blaring the horn at people, and other people don't. Some people just are passive aggressive, right? Like, when somebody's mad at you because it's the silent treatment, or it's because they have said something or two somethings to you, and those are the only one or two somethings that they've said to you in the last day, and it's all sarcastic, and did I do something? Like, because you know that somebody is angry whether they're loud about it or not. We kind of understand these things, and sometimes, we get angry for good reasons, right? Jesus flipped tables in the temple courtyard and was mad, and it was considered a righteous anger. You guys heard that term, righteous anger? If you've grown up in church, you've probably heard the term, or you've heard it referred to. Righteous anger is when you're angry about some injustice or something that it's like when certain groups of people are treated unfairly. You get angry about that, right? Because that's not right. You want people to be treated fairly. You maybe have a righteous anger when there's things that you care about that aren't taken seriously, or when you aren't taken seriously, and it's frustrating. Or maybe like something heavier like racism. When you see that, it makes you angry. When you watch Remember the Titans and you see them not let them eat there in the diner because the fact that they're black, it makes you angry. And you're watching that movie and you can relate to that feeling because you don't like injustice. Or maybe you get angry at the fact that all over the world there are people who don't even have access to clean water. And that's something to be angry about. You're angry because this whole year has left a lot of people in mental health crises that didn't need an extra health crisis. And so you're angry about that. And whatever it is, whether it's a righteous anger, whether it's an inward anger, whether it's an outward anger, we all recognize it. And sometimes the righteous anger even, like, that's not bad to feel. Like I said, even Jesus felt it, but it's what we do with it. And no matter which one you feel, we all can recognize that anger is a powerful emotion. It has the ability to take over your mind and body in ways that when you, like, if you had an out-of-body experience and you watched yourself have a little anger temper tantrum, you would think, I don't know who that person is and I'm embarrassed to look at that person, right? Anger makes us do those things. It turns us into people that we don't like to admit that sometimes we are. The question is, what do we do with it, and how do we keep the destructive anger from taking over our lives? And that's a legitimate question. It's something that I kind of mentioned last week when we started this series. Of all the emotions, anger is the one I probably relate to the most. I like to say, because I'm a pastor, that it's righteous anger most of the time. I'm angry at things for not being right in the world. But to be honest, that would be a cop-out, because really sometimes I'm just prone to anger because maybe that's where my bend towards sin is sometimes. And I don't want you to feel like weird about it. It occurred to me last week that I don't want people to think like they have to step on ice around me. I'm really not. Probably none of you have actually ever seen me angry. I'm pretty good at controlling it most of the time. But when it does come out, those closest to me have seen it, and I'm not always proud of it. And it's something that I have to work on. And whether it's, it used to be when I was your age, it was an outward thing a lot. And the older I get, I've learned to just make it an inward thing when I feel anger. And most of the time, it takes a lot to get me angry nowadays. Again, unless I'm behind the wheel of a car. But in general, it takes a lot to get me really kind of worked up. But then when I do, Chelsea doesn't like being around me. My friends don't like being around me. And pretty much nobody wants to be. Sometimes I feel like God doesn't want to be around me when I'm angry, because I, again, don't recognize who I am sometimes when anger has taken hold of my life. This last year has tested that for me personally in a lot of ways, just to be transparent. But today I want us to look at a passage that comes from the book of James. Now James, many of you know, he's the brother of Jesus. He doesn't believe that Jesus is the Messiah until after the resurrection. Then he goes, oh, he was right, okay. And then James, which is kind of a big deal for us reading now, because to recognize that Jesus' own brother admits that Jesus is who he says he was, that's a big deal. And James is writing to the church, and he has a lot to say when it comes to this idea of anger. And he starts by saying this in James chapter 3, verse 13. He says, "Who is wise and understanding among you?" And it's a good way to start this. It's a good question, because a lot of times, let's just clarify our terms real quick, because wise is a word that we use a lot, particularly in church contexts. And sometimes maybe your parents say, is that a wise decision, right? And a lot of times we think or equate the word wise with smart. And there is a difference. Anybody want to, if you probably know because you're in high school, what's the difference between wise and smart? Shout it out. What is smart? What would you define as smart? Knowing things. That's good. What is wise? Say it again. Like advice? Is that what you said? Yeah? Okay, you can have wise advice, the ability to give advice. I like to use discernment when I think about wisdom. Does that sound more like a street term? Discernment? Both of those are probably terms you don't use every day. But wise, smart is when you know things. It's when it's kind of like your brain can put things together quicker because you're smart. But wisdom is knowing the difference to when you should apply your smarts and when not. Wisdom is knowing what to do in a situation, or discernment, where you can discern what the right choice is. And a lot of times experience, people point to experience as making them wiser. We think of older people as wise because they're older and they have more experiences than us. And a lot of times that's the case, but a lot of times it's not. Because actually, knowing more doesn't mean that you'll actually do better, right? It takes wisdom to intervene. It's how you've learned from past experiences and apply that to today. That's wisdom. So he asks, who is wise and understanding among you? And then he goes on to the next verse. Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from what? From wisdom. So James is making a connection here. He's saying that wise people are humble people. So I guess then another question would be, what does humility mean? What does that look like? It starts, I think, with a proper view of yourself. But it's when you don't see yourself as the exception to the rules. Now, how many of us, when we're angry because somebody else did something they weren't supposed to do? whether it's cut you off on the road or in the hallway or whatever it is. The ref made a bad call. You're angry. You're angry because somebody didn't abide by the rules. Somebody didn't do it right, and therefore things are unfair, right? Is that a fair statement? That maybe, but humility is you don't see yourself as an exception to the rules, meaning you're not always right. Humility also means you don't think that the world revolves around you and your desires. It means you're able to put yourself in other people's shoes and see from a different perspective. That's sometimes called empathy. Or you don't think that you deserve better treatment than everyone else. It can also mean you don't see everyone else as a means to an end that you want. Meaning that you may recognize the world doesn't revolve around you, but here's where smart and wise don't necessarily go hand in hand. You might be smart enough to trick people into doing what you want them to do, but it doesn't make you wise for being able to do that and manipulate in that way. So being humble and having humility means you don't see everyone else as a means to your end. So James is saying that wise people don't do these things. He continues in the next verse, but if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Okay? If you have something that you're angry about, how often do we go to our friends and we just like to vent, right? We vent about what we're frustrated about. We're harboring bitter envy and selfish ambition. We're venting because we just need to let it out, right? And I get the need to do that. But sometimes that venting becomes what other word that begins with a G? Gossip. Venting can quickly turn into something that's not healthy. So if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, don't boast about it. And don't deny that it's there. Sometimes we pretend, it's not a big deal. This is usually the passive-aggressive person that says, it's not a big deal, but really it's a big deal to them. And they just don't want to make a fuss about anything, but secretly they're going to harbor this bitter envy in their heart about it. So don't deny the truth. And then he says this, for where you have selfish ambition, or have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder in every evil practice. There you find disorder in every evil practice. I feel like that jumped from 0 to 100 in 2.5 seconds. Don't have, bitterness and envy, and don't deny that you have it. And also if you do, it's part of the most evil thing in the world, right? He's basically saying every kind of disorder and every evil thing comes from that. So when pride or arrogance gets inside of us, it comes out in our actions. When we don't have humility, we have pride, right? With arrogance. And so that comes out in our actions. It's not great, but then he goes on, and he kind of, in order to illustrate his point, he asks a couple questions, right? He says this. He says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Now, if I were to ask you this today, and this isn't James talking, this is Zach talking, and come up to you after school, and I say, hey, what's up? What causes fights and quarrels? I wouldn't say that. Hey, what do you guys fight about these days? That's what I would say. What would your answer be? Think about it for a second. What causes fights amongst you and maybe your friends, or you and your parents, or you and your siblings, or you and your coach, or your teachers, or whatever? What causes fights? What would you say? It's a good question, but usually when we hear that question, we answer with, I want you to see if you can notice the common denominator in this, okay? When we think about who causes fights and quarrels, or what causes fights and quarrels, we think, when my parents have unrealistic rules or expectations, or when my siblings won't stop being annoying, that causes some fights and quarrels, or maybe when my friends are, not the nicest. They don't text me back, or they're ignoring me, or they don't invite me to whatever, or they didn't tag me in that, whatever it is. Maybe you got something against your friends. They talked about you behind your back. Maybe you would say, a parent or step-parent acts like they're always right, and that causes fights and quarrels because they can't just admit when they were wrong, right? Or people that have obnoxious, beyond belief TikTok accounts, right? Or something where they post whatever on social media, and you look at that and you're like, why are they the way that they are? And you could just unfollow them, but you kind of like getting upset about them every time you see it and having another thing to vent about, so you don't unfollow them. So what causes fights and quarrels among you? We all have this answer, and here's the common denominator. Anybody catch on what it was? Well, you're nodding your head. that you're not the problem. Yes. The common denominator when we think about what causes fights and quarrels among us is, well, other people, this or that. We like to blame the fights and quarrels on the people around us, but we very rarely look inwardly because that's much harder to do. We all have an answer that's outside of us about, that causes the problems that we have. But James, he doesn't buy it, and I think if we think about it longer than 2 seconds, we recognize that this is true as well. He answers his question with another question. What causes fights and quarrels among you? He says, don't they come from your desires that battle within you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? In other words, yes, maybe some people around you may be annoying or do things that are unjust or whatever it is, that might be true. But what is it in you that makes you angry? What is it about that makes you turn into a person that you don't like to look at in the mirror when that happens? As long as we think that the problem is somebody else, it's their behavior, it's their character, it's their actions, it's their mistake, we'll never be able to deal with the problem inside of us. Because if we're honest, that's a cop-out. When we think about what causes fights among us or what makes us upset, if we just point to the people around us, which is really, really easy to do, in case you haven't noticed, it's really easy to be upset at other people's actions. But when that controls us, when that takes over in us, when we don't deal with what that's doing inside of us, even if it's not our fault, we can become victims of our own emotions, and victims specifically of the anger and the bitterness that builds inside of us. And this is what James is cautioning us from, because ultimately, yeah, other people do things that'll make you mad, but it's from what happens inside of you. That if you don't deal with that, then no matter what people do, it's going to get the best of you. We think that the problem is maybe people not doing things our way, because when we're angry, it's because we're not getting our way. If we boil it all down to that, it's because we're not getting our way. They did that, and therefore it's not happening the way I wanted. Or they didn't do this, and therefore it's or whatever it is. It's not our way. Because if it's our way, then there would be no hurting people. There would be nothing that's unfair. There would be no people who are suffering, and that would be our way. And therefore we're angry about it because it's not the way we want things. But again, as long as the problem is something that you think is outside of you, you'll never deal with what's going on in your own heart. And I get that it's easy to maybe disagree with that, at least initially, because I can even, in my own thoughts, as I was preparing this, I was like, man, I could argue with that. What if it is a righteous anger? What if it is this and that? I think that's why James says it's the evil desires within our hearts, because again, even if it's a righteous anger, if we're getting upset, if we're letting that control us, here's the thing. When our anger gets the better of us, whether it's righteous or not, if our anger begins to control us, then we've lost. And ultimately, if we allow our anger to get the better of us, then we are giving the control of our emotions and our mental well-being and our emotional health to other people. How many of you would willingly like to give up control and to give other people the key to your emotional heart? Anybody? You want to allow that person, that bully in your school, to be the one that controls whether or not you're content? Or do you want to be able to control that yourself? Do you want to control how you respond to things, or what your emotions do to your mental health and well-being? Or do you want to give other people the keys to your brain in that sense? I think all of us would say, obviously, I want the control. I don't want to be controlled by anybody. I want freedom. I want freedom from my anger. And I think when it all boils down to it, when we don't address what's going on inside of us, then we're giving other people control. And righteous anger is one specifically that I wrestle with, but I think even when you look in the example where Jesus was outside the temple courts and he's flipping the tables and he's angry. And for good cause, good reason. But whenever you see righteous anger, it always pushes you towards something good. It's that drive. Like if you I use this in the middle school lesson example. I don't know if you guys, you probably don't, so I can use this example here. But if like I think of Stephanie Freed, who's the founder of a place called Rafa House in Joplin, Missouri, but they're a national organization now, and they work really hard to rescue young girls from sex trafficking. And when she does this, it was because she was angry at the injustices that were going on for these girls. And she wanted to do something about it. That righteous anger led her to start this organization that has done this for thousands of girls. And not only do they rescue them, they help restore them. And they help them heal through the process of everything that they've experienced. And that's a huge thing. Righteous anger can lead us to do things that need to get done. It can be a driving force for us. But when we allow the anger to control us and not just motivate us, that's where we're defining the difference in this. Because most of the time, our anger is not righteous. If you're anything like me, then the righteous part of the anger is probably the exception to the rule rather than the rule. It's easy to point to the problem in others, but again, as long as we're looking to other people for the reason for what we're feeling, then other people will have control over our emotions. In psychology, that's called codependency or transference. You guys heard those terms? It's when you give, your mood is based on what other people around you do, and that's not a fun place to be. So, based on all of that, I have a question for you, okay? So, what's your relationship with anger? Do you control it, or does it control you? Do you experience it outwardly or inwardly, or righteously, or both, or all of the above, or whatever? What do you gravitate to the most? What is your relationship like with that anger, and do you have the control, or does it control you most of the time? If I were to go around into your home, and if I were to ask your family members, if I were to ask your mom or your dad or your siblings, or if I were to go to your practice and ask your coach, or if I were to walk into your classrooms and ask your teachers about you and your relationship with anger, what would they say? And I think that's a self-reflective question that we all should be faced with and should answer. Because if we want to be a whole person, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, then we have to confront what's going on in our own hearts. I almost said we have to confront the vibes inside, but then that was going to sound really cheesy, so I didn't say that. But then I just said it anyway. So, anyway, you get what I'm saying. When we recognize that there's something inside of us that is broken because of sin, and we face it head on, we're much more likely to end up in a better place. So ask yourself, what am I not getting that is causing my anger? Because again, if anger is kind of based on this premise that we're not getting what we want, then what is it that you're not getting that's making you angry? It's a good self-reflective question. So as we kind of wrap up, just got one more verse really to share with you. And when Paul is writing the church in Philippi, this is what he says. He's writing, and in Philippians chapter 2, this is what he says. He's talking about like our greatest example, especially when it comes to our emotions and stuff. He says, he's talking about Jesus, who, being in very nature as God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. In other words, Jesus was in every sense of the word God. He was God in the flesh, but he didn't use that to his advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. Jesus had every reason to get his own way because he was God, but he didn't. He gave up his right to have his own way because ultimately he wanted to reach you and I and where we were at and show us who God is, who our real Father is. And then Paul actually started this whole thing back in verse 1 with this. He says, therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love. In other words, following the example of Jesus is how we keep anger from controlling us. Because of Jesus, anger doesn't have to be the boss of you. So as we get ready to go in our groups, in your personal circumstances, what would it look like for you to choose wisdom and humility over anger? What would it look like in your conversations? What would it look like in your relationships? What would it look like in the situations that you find yourself in on a regular basis? What would it look like for you to choose wisdom and humility over anger? Think about that. I'll pray for you guys, and we'll go to our groups.